Okay, this is chapter 24, and we're going to talk about digestion. And this is going to be part one of another part, which is going to be part two. So this is part one. And so, like this is the cover slide, but I usually like to start out by talking about why we're talking about the system. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious in some cases. But this is kind of interesting. The gastrointestinal diseases account for nearly a tenth of money spent on healthcare. So we're talking about treatment and we're talking about medications that are involved. And most of us have taken medications for GI issues. So heartburn. So you can take some people take antacids, indigestion, um, gas, belching, bloating, flatulence, constipation, irritable bowel syndrome, ulcers, cancer. So we go all the way here from heartburn down to cancer. And most of us have had at least one time in our life experience with at least the top four. A lot of people have irritable bowel syndrome. This doesn't even mention uh, irritable bowel diseases like Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, which probably people in the class have that. They're usually kind of immune related. But those can be quite a problem where you have to have parts of your GI system in some cases removed where that damage has taken place. So I have a picture up here and it's a cartoon, but it actually says a lot of stuff. So we have the pizza coming in, then we have the teeth chomping on it. So the teeth are going to increase that surface area so your enzymes don't have to, you know, try to break down a whole piece of pizza. It can break down little pieces, which is easier. And then we have, I don't know, the tongue, whatever it's doing. I guess it's pushing food to the back of the mouth, which it does do. It's using a plunger here. And then it pushes it down through the esophagus, which is this guy, and he's responsible for swallowing. So that's why he has a little lever there. He has that swallowing deglutition reflex that allows food to move into the stomach, which is this fish tank looking thing here. And and that's the stomach. And the stomach is making acid and adding acid, and we'll talk about what that does. What's really kind of interesting is down here, these accessory organs. You have the liver, and the liver is pouring something into, after it's left the stomach, pouring something into the intestines, which are all down here. And what it's pouring in there is bile. And you see the gallbladder over here, which is holding the bile, which is exactly what happens. So the liver makes bile, and the gallbladder will hold it or store it until it's needed. Then you have the pancreas over here that's adding something, and he's adding enzymes, and lots of enzymes. Enzymes capable of breaking down just about every kind of biomolecule that you would put in there. And then it moves through the intestines and then out, and I guess as feces. This looks pretty bad in there. You can see the irritable bowel here because of irritable bowel syndrome, and he's the irritable bowel, which is kind of cute, I guess. All right, so those are our notes. And then, let's see. So one thing that's interesting is we have this thing called the alimentary canal. Alimentary canal. And it's really just a tube. So if we just look at what our digestive system is, it is a tube. And it goes all the way through. Now, we like to think of our stomach as being this little unique organ, but all it is it's an enlarged part of the tube. So the tube kind of goes down, and then there's a big part, and then it just continues on out to the other side. Gets a little bigger in this large intestine, and then that's it. So really, that's what we're talking about. Now, what happens in the process is a lot of enzymes. So we have mechanical, I mean, the easiest way to think of mechanical is the teeth chomp something up. The stomach grinds stuff too. I don't know if you were aware of that, but just about everything has some kind of mechanical uh, function, whether it's just moving stuff down, or in the intestines where it kind of moves it back and forth and kind of pushes it down. And we're going to talk about all those things. So that's mechanical digestion. But then we have enzymatic digestion or chemical digestion. But both of these things together break things down and make it to make these small molecules for absorption. And so if you have something like a marble, somebody like a child or maybe an adult swallows a marble accidentally, that's just going to move right on through and out the other side because your body's not going to be interested in that. It's not going to know how to break it down. And so it's just going to pass it right on through. So when we talk about things that are digested, we're talking about biomolecules. And we're going to list those. And I don't know if molecule sounds like a big word, but really we're talking about proteins, carbohydrates, DNA, RNA, fats, and lipids. That's what we're talking about with biomolecules. That's what the digestive system knows how to break down. So yeah, it's going to keep those things because those things can be used as nutrients and let the rest go, like the marble. And along with some other waste, mostly from the liver. So the inside of your GI system is technically still outside your body. If we swallow that marble, it never gets absorbed. Therefore, it is never in our body. Okay? It is still outside the body. It's like a hole in a donut. Okay? The donut part is the part of your body, and then the hole is just this alimentary canal that goes right through the middle of our bodies. So let's talk about these biomolecules. So we should be familiar with them by now. Carbohydrates, sugars and starches, lipids, fats, proteins, which are chains of amino acids. We've talked about that. And then nucleic acids, we have to include those because just about anything we eat is or was alive. And so it's going to have DNA and RNA in it. So, but these things are usually, I mean, especially like a protein. A protein is this huge molecule most of the time. And you can't just absorb a protein. That would be not good. So, so it has to be broken down into those, individual amino acids. So they have to be broken down to their simplest form, usually by enzymes. So we have enzymes for that are made in various places that we'll talk about. That's where things get kind of complicated. Yeah, and so those things are broken down, and we'll get into that. So we also absorb vitamins. We should know that. Minerals. And then random molecules. So I like this category because that includes just everything else. I mean, we don't just absorb the nutrients that we need. Sometimes other stuff gets by, which is good because that includes drugs. And unfortunately, it also includes toxins. So drugs, meaning medications, can be absorbed. And toxins, of course, are things that poison us. All right, so we have to talk about anatomy. And we'll go through this kind of quickly. So I already mentioned the alimentary canal, and that's the GI tract, refers to the stomach and the intestines. So that's where we're talking about the tube. Okay, that's your alimentary canal, and this is the stomach right there. Let's see, and then we have, so GI tract, stomach, and intestines. And then we have the accessory organs that are kind of helping things out, and we'll get into those. I don't know if we'll get into them in this part. Maybe we'll start. And then, so and this is really how we're kind of going to go through this whole section, but we're going to start by kind of moving through. So we have the mouth, oral cavity, which has like the teeth, the salivary glands, the tongue, I guess. Then the pharynx, which is just a fancy word for the throat, which is different than the esophagus. The esophagus is that muscular tube that pushes food down into the stomach, into the small intestine, which are broken up into its individual parts, and the large intestine, which is broken up into its individual part. Most of that is going to be the colon. Usually when we're talking about the colon, we're talking about the large intestine. And then it all comes out the anus. Okay, so liver, gallbladder, pancreas, major accessory organs that we'll talk about. So it's all surrounded by a big membrane. So all of these things, with a few exceptions, are surrounded by this membrane. Now, we do see that I think the kidneys kind of sit back here, but they're not really part of the digestive system. And we see parts, so the pancreas is kind of what we would call retroperitoneal. And that's the kidney there. And then parts of the small intestine, the duodenum, part of that is retroperitoneal. That means it's behind the peritoneal lining, or the peritoneum. So the peritoneum is just a membrane that kind of holds it all together. So the part that's near the organs we call the visceral. That's true with any membrane that covers anything. The part that's on the organ side is called visceral, and the part that's on wall side, the body wall side, we call that parietal. That's just a naming scheme that somebody came up with and decided it was important. So mesenteries are interesting because mesenteries are going to hold the organs in place within that peritoneum. So holds the organs in place, 2 layers of peritoneum with loose connective tissue in between. So we can kind of see that the peritoneum kind of moves in here and kind of attaches to the organs, and that's what it does. It attaches to the intestines so they don't just, you lay on your side, your intestines just kind of flop and just kind of get all tangled up. That's not going to happen because they're kind of held together. And that's what the mesentery does in one way, but really the most important thing physiologically is it provides nerves and blood supply to the digestive organs. So that's a way for your circulatory system to get nutrients down to it. And then we'll talk about how those nutrients have to be absorbed and then taken back up, usually to pretty much right to the liver. All right, so just talked about retroperitoneal. Certain organs are covered by the peritoneum only on only one surface and are considered behind it. Okay, so that's what we mean by retro. It's like 70s music or whatever is old music to you. Retro. Behind. All right. Now, if we look at the intestines, they're not really like, I mean, I guess they're kind of like blood vessels, but a lot more complicated, a lot more stuff going on. They're also vascularized, so they have blood vessels going to them. They have nerves going to them. The lymph system is also involved. They have glands that are producing and then excreting or secreting fluid into them. This is the lymph system we see. So all of this stuff, we have this muscular layer. We like to talk about the mucosal layer. So you're going to see that term a lot, mucosal layer. Well, that's the layer that makes mucus. And so that's going to be more on the inner part. And you've got everything covered by mucus all the time. If you didn't, you would just digest your intestines. Your GI system doesn't know the difference. An intestine is meat to it. So you've got the mucus layer that's kind of lining that to protect it. And then, of course, there's muscle, and then the outer layer, the membrane around it. So the layers, the serosa, protective outer layer, the muscularis layer, which is the muscle, and these are smooth muscles, so not under voluntary control. You can't just like start pushing food back and forth inside your gut. And then the mucosa and the submucosa, that's the glands and vessels around the lumen. And the lumen is just the opening, just the open part. We just call that a lumen. So functions of the digestive system, well, ingestion, you eat the food, you put it in your mouth. Okay, put the food in your mouth, and then it moves down to the stomach. Ultimately, mastication, fancy word for chewing, that's going to increase the surface area. Propulsion and mixing, so that happens in the stomach and in the intestine. We're going to get into each of these more. It sounds like I'm kind of pushing through them pretty fast. But deglutition, that's our fancy word for swallowing. Peristalsis is that undulating movement that kind of pushes food forward, or I guess it would be chyme at that point. That's the name for that. We'll talk about it. But yeah, your intestines kind of make this undulating movement that moves food forward through them, and that's peristalsis. Secretion lubricates like mucus, liquefies, digests water, or water liquefies and digests enzymes. So all of these things are secreted. Bile emulsifies fat. We'll talk about what it does. Enzymes, which are also here, are for chemical digestion. So we have mechanical digestion, which is kind of the grinding or the moving back and forth of food. The stomach grinds, the teeth grind, the intestines move it around. That's mechanical. And then chemical, which is enzymatic. So once we've broken this food down, we have to absorb it. So we have absorption here, movement from the tract into circulation or into the lymph system. And then elimination. So waste products are removed from the body. That's feces. That's the process of defecation. So let's talk about this term peristalsis. Peristalsis can refer to a lot of things. It's not just the intestine. Any tube that is pushing something through in this way, that is peristalsis. So in the case of the intestines, though, and the esophagus, it moves a bolus forward. A bolus is just a chunk, or like if you give a bolus injection, that means you give it all at one time. So it's a grouping instead of it being just like scattered all the way through, or like giving an injection that, or giving an IV an IV infusion where you're just kind of putting it through all the time, a little by little. This is just all at once. So we call it a bolus. It's just a chunk of stuff. So peristalsis is the process that's this coordinated muscular activity that takes place in the esophagus and the intestines that will push this bolus, this chunk of food forward. Um, so that occurs, yep, esophagus, intestines. And then we have this other thing called segmentation. Segmentation doesn't just move it forward, it kind of moves it back and forth. It's like if you were, trying to mix something up, you wouldn't just keep pushing it forward. You'd say, okay, now we're going to go back, and then we're going to go this way again. So it kind of moves it back and forth to kind of keep it mixed and give the enzymes access and all that other stuff. So let's start at the beginning. Those were just terms. Let's start at the beginning. Oral cavity bounded by the lips and the opening of the pharynx. So we have the palate, and we have the hard palate, which is anterior. You can kind of feel it. It's the hard palate in the kind of the roof of your mouth here. And then we have the soft palate, which is kind of squishy. That's kind of in the back. That's the soft palate. So anterior, which means forward, and then posterior, which means toward the back, is the soft palate. Anterior is the hard palate. Consists of skeletal muscle and connective tissue. The uvula reminds me of Monster House, if you remember seeing that. But the uvula is this little flap that's hanging down here. Change colors. Little flap that's hanging down that kind of flips up and prevents food from just going up into your nose. That's really its job. When you swallow, it automatically flips up because it knows food's going back there and it doesn't want it to go up. It wants it to go down through your esophagus. That's the uvula. The tongue mixes food around in your mouth. We should know that. Teeth, chomps on it, breaks it down. And so we have two sets of teeth. We have the primary or deciduous, or sometimes people call them milk teeth. And that's your childhood teeth. Those are the ones you lose. So when you lose a tooth as a child, you're losing your primary teeth. And then you have the permanent. That if you lose those, they're just kind of gone. All right, so let's talk about teeth a little bit. Or not talk about teeth, but let's talk about what they do. So this process is called mastication. That's chewing. And the purpose of chewing is to increase surface area. It's in red and underlined right here. Chewing food increases surface area. Why do we want to increase surface area? Why can't we just swallow a pizza whole, or just swallow a chicken whole like a big snake would? Well, because we don't have the I guess the digestive system of a snake, for one, and we need to move it through more quickly because we eat more than just, I don't know how often a snake eats. I guess it depends on the snake, but geez, they can go for a month without eating because they just sort of digest it slowly. It's like they keep it in there. But we want to digest our food more quickly, have quicker access to it for whatever reason. And so instead of having a giant piece of pizza, we break it into little bits. And then if we break it into little bits, then enzymes can get in there and break it down more quickly. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about increasing surface area. So the mastication reflex, it's a reflex. It's pretty much done automatically, and your tongue stays out of the way, which is pretty cool. But that's controlled by the medulla, the brainstem. Yeah, it controls those basic movements in chewing. So most mechanical digestion takes place in the mouth. Well, I mean, that makes sense because that's where you have the pizza that's whole, and you're going to break it up into smaller pieces before it moves out. So it kind of has the advantage there because it's got the first access. Yeah, this is just a graph showing. So we see beetroot. I don't know, beetroot, why they chose that. And then we have meat down here. And it shows the number of chews. And of course, the more you chew it, the smaller the bits are. So that's, in case you didn't believe that chewing more broke it down into smaller bits, that's proof right there. Now we have the salivary gland, and things are going to start getting a little more complicated here. I don't know, or more interesting. Depends on how you want to look at it. But the salivary glands will make enzymes. So they produce saliva. Now saliva is going to lubricate the food, kind of adds water to it, so it can more easily go down the esophagus. But we have a few different salivary glands. I probably won't ask details about these because that's more of what I consider an anatomy or a lab thing. But we have the parotid artery, you can get it mixed up with carotid artery. But we have the parotid salivary gland, the submandibular salivary gland, and then the sublingual. Sublingual, when we talk about lingual in anatomy and physiology, we're talking about the tongue. So sublingual is going to be under the tongue, parotid is kind of back here. Okay. So what does the saliva do? That's what we need to learn. So it has antibacterial functions. There are certain things that will break down bacteria in some ways. It's not, ideal. It's not as effective as your immune system is. But it is kind of antibacterial. Bacteria don't want to survive in it very well. Now we know that's true, but we also know that there are a lot of bacteria that live in our mouth. It's figured out a way, and that's where that bacteria lives. So it can prevent infection, usually by just washing it into the stomach, honestly. It lubricates, it helps form that bolus. So we talked about that chunk or that bolus. So when we chew something up, we grind it up and then we turn it into a little ball, and that's what we swallow. Is we swallow that ball of food or that bolus of food, and that's what moves down the esophagus. It has buffers to keep it around a neutral pH, so that's the pH. I think that probably matters, is that that saliva is a neutral pH, because what are we going to compare it with? We're going to compare it with the stomach, which is acidic. Parasympathetic input causes salivary production. So your mouth waters when you smell food. That's a parasympathetic reflex. Remember, parasympathetic is rest and digest, so it makes sense. So this is one thing, just to prepare you, that we're going to talk about with all of these sections, or at least the mouth, the stomach, and the intestine, small intestine particularly, and large intestine, is what's being digested. So if we look at the mouth, and we're talking about saliva, it makes something called salivary amylase. And you need to know this. Amylase in general, and this is called salivary amylase because you also have pancreatic amylase. Guess what? They both do the same thing, and that's break down starch. Now, starch is just a long chain of monosaccharides, so like glucose. So it's a long chain of glucose. And amylase can break that down. Okay, so it breaks those into pieces. It's not in your mouth very long, but it can start to do the job. So it breaks it down into primarily disaccharides, which is just like two of these guys, but whatever. It's breaking it down. It's taking that long chain and it's breaking it into chunks. That's what's important. Now, this is what matters, it all matters, but this is another thing that's going to be very important for you to understand. Another enzyme in the saliva, besides the salivary amylase, that's actually doing something, is something called lingual lipase. Now, you should associate the word lipase with lipid. Okay. Now, this is what to remember. Lingual lipase is made in the mouth by the saliva, but it doesn't break anything down. It's not active in the saliva. It isn't active until it moves into the stomach. So it's made in the mouth, lingual lipase, made in the mouth, but it is activated by the stomach acid, which comes later. So if we were to ask what's being broken down or chemically, enzymatically digested in the mouth, really the only thing is carbohydrates. Sure, we're making lingual lipase in our mouth, but it doesn't work in there. It works in the stomach. So we have to get it to the stomach. So we're going to move through the esophagus. So we have this nice word because swallowing was way too simple and way too many people knew it. So we came up with another word, not me, I didn't, called deglutition. So deglutition is the act of swallowing. Now, that's a group of muscles called pharyngeal constrictors that contribute to muscle or to swallowing. Not too concerned about that, but there are a couple of parts that we need to think about. And that is, we have an upper esophageal sphincter. A sphincter is just a round muscle. Okay, it's a funny word, but that's all it is. It's a round muscle. We have sphincters all over the place, not just the anus. So we have an upper esophageal sphincter, and what those do is when they constrict, they close it off. So they close off that opening. So we don't want food just always moving into the esophagus. So at the top, so we have a sphincter up there. We also have a lower esophageal sphincter. Now the lower esophageal sphincter isn't in this picture. It is the upper esophageal sphincter is in the picture, and it's going to close that off. But the lower esophageal sphincter, we'll see that, I think, when we talk about the stomach, but that's the one that prevents stomach contents from moving up into your esophagus. Now, we know that that fails sometimes because that's what acid reflux is, or heartburn, is when that lower esophageal sphincter doesn't work the way it's supposed to. Either way, the upper esophageal sphincter is under conscious control. You can kind of open it. Usually when you start out swallowing, you can control your swallowing, and that opens the upper esophageal sphincter. Lower esophageal sphincter, you don't have that control. So that's no conscious control of the lower esophageal sphincter. It just kind of does what it wants. All right, so the esophagus in general transports food from the pharynx or the throat to the stomach. So it passes through the esophageal hiatus. I don't know how important that is, but if we think, you guys just covered the lungs, and so if we have lungs here, remember you just talked about the diaphragm that sits right here. The diaphragm muscle that pulls down on the lungs to kind of decrease that pressure, pulls so air moves in. There are a couple of holes in it because the stomach's down here. And so we have to have a hole in the esophagus, and we call that the esophageal hiatus. And that's an opening in that diaphragm that ends at the stomach. So when you swallow something, it moves through that hole, the esophageal hiatus, and into the stomach. You also have one for heart. Okay. So this is the process of deglutition. 3 phases: voluntary, and we can kind of work through these, and we kind of know it already. Just if you swallow, you can kind of move through these. But we have this voluntary. We move that bolus, again, the chunk of food. So you move that with your tongue to the back, to your throat, to the back of your oral cavity. And then, so that's a voluntary, and you start to swallow. You can swallow anytime you want to, but you can't control the entire process. So then you get into the pharyngeal phase, which is a reflex phase. So the upper esophageal sphincter relaxes for the food bolus. It opens up and lets the food move into the esophagus, and then it takes it away, and it does everything automatically. So it elevates the pharynx, opens the esophagus, food is pushed into the esophagus. The epiglottis, you can't just, the epiglottis is tipped posteriorly to block the trachea. Okay, so earlier we talked about the uvula and how the uvula kind of dangles down, and then it moves up to block things from moving into the nasal cavity. Well, something else, let's see if we can find it here. Oh, there it is. So the epiglottis prevents food from moving into the trachea or your windpipe. You don't want food to go down. There are 2 tubes there, and so every time you swallow, your epiglottis slaps over the trachea and prevents food from going down into your lungs. That's the wrong place for food. So that's the pharyngeal phase. It happens in the throat. That's why it's called pharyngeal. The pharynx is the throat. And then we have the esophageal. So stretching causes that peristalsis, and it moves the food down. So as food approaches the stomach, the lower esophageal sphincter opens and allows food to move into the stomach. And then after the food gets into the stomach, that lower esophageal sphincter is supposed to close back up again. So these guys are closed off, top and bottom, most of the time. And only when you swallow are they supposed to open. First, the upper esophageal sphincter opens, lets food in, peristalsis moves it down, and then the lower esophageal sphincter opens and allows food to move into the stomach, which is where we are next. So the stomach, here's our lower esophageal sphincter. Let's see, so right here, right there is where that is. And that's just that muscle that closes it off. Also sometimes called the cardiac sphincter because there's a cardiac part of the stomach, which is not confusing at all. But we'll just call it the lower esophageal sphincter. Now, in the same way that we had an upper and lower sphincter for the esophagus, we have a sphincter up here that's kind of controlling movement of food into the stomach. And we have something else down here called the pyloric sphincter, which is going to hold food in the stomach until it's ready to let it out. So a lot of gates during a digestion. And there are others as well that we're going to come across. So you let the food stays in here. Your pyloric sphincter may not open up right away. It leaves the food in there and the stomach will grind it. So we have motility, which means movement, and mechanical digestion. Your stomach moves a lot. Sometimes when your stomach growls, it's because there's air in there and it's doing these acrobatics. And this one looks really, really active. It looks kind of like it's having fun. But it's moving stuff around and it's grinding it up. So yeah, rugae, which are these kind of folds in the stomach that you can see when it's empty. But yeah, it's very muscular. The stomach is very muscular and grinds things. So we're going to get really bit by bit more and more complicated, and a lot of stuff is happening in the stomach, and there are enzymes that you have to know. Chyme is not an enzyme. We just can't call it food anymore. So you eat food in your mouth, you grind it up, you put it in that bolus thing, that chunk of food, which is the bolus, moves down into your stomach, and suddenly it's being mixed with acid in your stomach, and we can't call it food anymore. So we call it chyme. That's all that means, is chyme. So it's ingested food plus stomach secretions. Now, there are a lot of things that happen in the stomach. There are a lot of different cell types that are lining the stomach and around the stomach. So we're going to have to move through those and understand them. There are going to be a lot of test questions about these cells and what these cells are making. Parietal cells are particularly important. And we're gonna, on the next slide we're kind of gonna go over that process again. So hydrochloride or hydrochloric acid is made by the parietal cells. So most of us have heard that our stomach is very acidic. Well, it makes the acid, right? And it makes that acid in these parietal cells. So it's an extremely acidic environment, the stomach is. It kills bacteria. And remember that salivary amylase that was breaking down starches up in our mouth from the saliva? It's inactivated. So salivary amylase likes to work at around a neutral pH, and the stomach is very acidic. So stops carbohydrate digestion by inactivating salivary amylase. So if we're going to ask this question, not a lot of carbohydrate digestion takes place in the stomach because, at least not enzymatically. Now, something that does happen is, I'm sorry, we're still talking about acid, but it denatures protein. So what does denatures mean? So that word becomes important suddenly. Denatures means that it unfolds it. So it unfolds protein. So a folded up protein is kind of hard to get to, for the enzymes to get to, but the acid will kind of break the bonds that are holding it together in that nice shape, and it allows it to unwind. And if it unwinds, unfolds, then enzymes are going to be able to get to it to break it down more easily. Okay, and we're gonna get to that. Now, one other thing that stomach acid does, so these are things that stomach acid does. One other thing is that it converts this thing called pepsinogen to pepsin. Gen means generate or originate or create. So pepsinogen is this inactive form. Now, I like to talk about this because a lot of times it's not something we really think about. If you eat a stomach, you will digest it. So the question is, why do we not digest our own stomach? And the answer is because well, first of all, we already discussed maybe that mucus is lining it. But another kind of interesting thing is that if you have cells that make an enzyme, so just think about this for a second. You have a cell that makes an enzyme that is possible of destroying every protein in that cell. So do you think that cell wants to make just an active enzyme? No, it doesn't. So it makes this thing called pepsinogen, which is not active. So that's an inactive enzyme, an inactive protein. That way it doesn't just break down all of the stuff related to the cell. Now, when that pepsinogen hits the acid, this acid of the stomach, it turns it into this enzyme, protein enzyme, called pepsin. And pepsin is what's responsible for breaking down proteins. Okay? So we just said that carbohydrates are not really broken down in the stomach, but proteins are, because you have pepsin that's being made to break down the protein. So pepsinogen is released as an inactive protein, converted into pepsin by the stomach acid, and pepsin catalyzes or speeds up the breakage of covalent bonds in proteins, leaving small peptides and amino acids. Remember, our proteins are just big long chains of amino acids. Well, this breaks it down into those smaller individual amino acids and, smaller little peptides, like, less than 10, usually a couple. And so that's a protein that's not going to work anymore, which is really good, because we don't want to have, I think I've mentioned this before, we don't want to just absorb like a lion or cheetah. You don't want to just absorb whole proteins that are functional. I mean, if you eat beef and it's got cow proteins in it, I don't know if you would become a cow or not, but they have different enzymes, and so you don't want those to be functional in your body. I would eat a cheetah so I could run fast. I think that might work. Probably not. So, but the point is you don't want to absorb full proteins, and that would be a bad thing. So mucus is also made. Mucus is made all the way along all of these, all the way from the mouth all the way to the anus. So mucus is viscous and alkaline, but it has a very important role in the stomach because of that acidic environment. It protects the stomach from that acid, and it protects it from the enzyme pepsin. So that means we can put the pepsinogen out into the stomach, say, do your thing, break down your stuff, and the mucus will prevent it from breaking down the stomach itself. Irritation of the stomach mucosa causes greater mucus, so that's kind of a protective mechanism. So if things are irritated in there, but whether it's something that you eat or disease, peptic inflammation, something like that, you'll make more mucus to kind of protect it. Okay, so we've been through a few things. Something else that's made by the stomach that is very important, okay, will be asked about, and that is intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor is kind of fun. In your stomach, have you ever heard that that vegetarians, well, I guess that doesn't really matter, but B12 is kind of a big deal. So B12, and they say that B12 can only come from meat. That's not really true. It comes from bacteria, but it's bacteria in the meat. But B12 is a vitamin. And it's responsible for a lot of things. It's responsible for cell division, making blood cells. red blood cells. It's responsible for that, and other blood cells too, for that matter, but red blood cells in particular. It's important for myelin, the myelin sheath that covers your nerves. And I'm saying this stuff for a reason. Because the thing is that in your stomach, here's the thing. B12 can't be absorbed, not very easily. You really don't absorb B12. But we do, because we have to. So your body has formed a trick, and that is that since B12 by itself can't be absorbed, your body makes this thing called, we're finally to it, intrinsic factor. In fact, the parietal cells make intrinsic factor that are also making acid. So they make this protein called intrinsic factor, and this protein works like a nanny or something, and it says, oh, hi, B12, we're friends now, binds to that and helps it be absorbed. That's a terrible picture because that's not to scale, but that's what it does. So what did I just say? Intrinsic factor is made by parietal cells in the stomach. It is a protein that will help you absorb B12. And really, a lot of this absorption takes place in the intestine, but the intrinsic factor is made in the stomach. Very important. So intrinsic factor made by parietal cells binds with B12, helps it to be absorbed. B12 is necessary for DNA synthesis. Now, you may have heard of pernicious anemia. Pernicious anemia, sometimes as people get older, they don't make as much intrinsic factor, and they get anemic because they can't make red blood cells, and that's because they can't absorb B12. A lot of people have to get B12 injections because they don't make the intrinsic factor. They could eat B12 all day, all night, might help a little, but it's not going to be enough without that intrinsic factor to help it be absorbed. Okay, so it can lead to anemia and also nervous system problems. Okay, so we're going to keep going. So we've already talked about parietal cells. Now, there are other secretions of the stomach. Brain cells or amino acids in food cause the activation of these cells called G cells. G cells are a nice name for these cells because they make something called gastrin. Okay? Gastrin is a hormone, and you can kind of see, I like this picture down here because it kind of shows a lot of these. It doesn't show gastrin, but gastrin is a hormone that's activated. Let's just say it's activated when you eat. So when food is present, it's detected, and so these G cells will produce this hormone called gastrin. Gastrin's going to sort of start a process of enzymatic digestion. So gastrin activates these things called endochromaffin-like cells, ECL cells. We're just going to call them ECL cells. So it activates these ECL cells. And these ECL cells, whoops, lost it, got it back. These ECL cells release histamine. You probably heard of histamine in terms of allergies. Same histamine, but not involved in allergies in this case. It has a completely different function. The body's efficient like that. So these ECL cells release histamine, and they increase motility. Okay, histamine, so we're going to kind of go backwards here. Histamine activates the parietal cells. Okay. Parietal cells, as we just learned, make hydrochloric acid, and they make intrinsic factor, so we can absorb B12. We're not stopping yet. The hydrochloric acid, in addition to turning, I know you're all lost, pepsinogen, so that's one of the things that the hydrochloric acid does, turns pepsinogen into pepsin, okay, which helps break down proteins. But another thing that hydrochloric acid does is it activates these other cells called chief cells. Oh, wait, actually, I'm repeating myself here. Okay, I'm repeating myself. HCl activates chief cells, and it's the chief cells that release pepsinogen. There we go. Got ahead of myself, actually. So chief cells release the pepsinogen. The inactive pepsinogen is activated to pepsin by stomach acid. It breaks it down into proteins. So let's kind of go over that again, but quicker, so we can kind of make it make sense. You eat something, it activates G cells. G cells release a hormone called gastrin. Gastrin says, hey, we're eating something, activates these other cells called ECL cells, and they release histamine. Okay? The histamine says, hey, parietal cells, we're eating something. So the parietal cells say, okay, well, it's time for me to make more acid, stomach acid, and make intrinsic factor. And when it makes the stomach acid activates these things called chief cells. And it's the chief cells that actually make the pepsinogen, and which turns into pepsin, so you can break down proteins. There are a lot of steps to this, but it's really kind of a story. As it goes through, it's just a matter of remembering what order and what's making what. And that's what you're going to have to study. That's what you're going to have to learn. Okay. Only 4 more slides. Hydrochloric acid production. So we just mentioned that the parietal cells make hydrochloric acid. I'm not going to get into this too much, except to point out this equation. This equation, it's come up before. It's going to come up when we talk about kidneys. It came up likely when you talked about respiration and breathing. And you have this really cool trick where carbon dioxide and water, 2 things that are readily available in the air, can turn into carbonic acid, and then you can break off a hydrogen, that's what we see here, to form acid. Okay? A little bit of chloride, and will also move in, and essentially what you end up with is hydrochloric acid in the stomach. Okay, so that's how it's made. It's the same carbonic acid bicarbonate pathway. So this is why breathing can change the pH of your blood, but this mechanism is nice because we can just use it to make the acid for the stomach. And I guess I should be coming from the hydrogen because that's what makes the stomach acidic. Okay, so the hydrogen that is made is pumped directly into glands of the stomach, which makes the stomach acidic. All right, so what digestion takes place in the stomach? Well, hopefully our chief cells are making pepsinogen, and that is pepsin, and pepsin breaks down proteins. Okay. So we know that proteins are broken down. They're denatured and unfolded by the hydrochloric acid of the stomach, so we've talked about that. And they're broken down into individual amino acids and short little peptides by pepsin that was produced by the pepsinogen that was made by the chief cells, that was activated by the hydrochloric acid that was made by the parietal cells, that was started by histamine, which was triggered to be released by gastrin. Okay, sorry, I didn't invent this stuff, but it is a string of events. So another thing besides proteins are lipids. Now we already talked about, we kind of forgot about maybe already, but lingual lipase. Remember that stuff that was made in the saliva, made in the mouth, and put into the saliva, and then you swallowed it? It's activated in the stomach acid. So that's another thing that's activated by the stomach acid. That'd be a fun question, wouldn't it? Which of these things are activated by the stomach acid? Well, lingual lipase is, and pepsinogen is. Yeah. Okay, so chief cells are activated by stomach acid. That would be a good question. So lipids, bilingual lipase, it was made in the mouth, activated by stomach acid. So really, another easier test question would be, what digestion takes place in the stomach? It's right there. Proteins and lipids. Carbohydrates, not really. Nope, not much at all. So not carbohydrates, because that salivary amylase was inactivated by the stomach acid. Now, another interesting thing, carbohydrates tend to move through the stomach first, more quickly. So if you eat something that has a lot of carbohydrates, it's going to move through faster. Proteins a little bit slower, and lipids are the slowest to move through the stomach. Okay. Since we're really probably excited and having so much fun with all of these chemicals that are happening, we're going to talk about the small intestine before we go. This was supposed to be an hour-and-a-half lecture. We should be done within an hour, though, so that's kind of nice, even though it feels long. So this chyme stuff, so after the chyme or the food that we have eaten has been kind of digested by the stomach, especially the lipids and the proteins that are enzymatically broken down, it moves into the small intestine. And so the chyme moves from the small intestine a little at a time. So your stomach, that pyloric sphincter, kind of opens up and a little at a time and then closes, opens a little, closes, and lets food out of the stomach a little bit at a time. The small intestine, I'll just give it away. It's kind of a spoiler, but what's broken down, enzymatically broken down in the small intestine? Everything. Everything, all of the biomolecules that we listed, the proteins, the fats, the carbohydrates, the DNA, and the RNA. All of that stuff is broken down by the small intestine. So it is the site of the greatest amount of digestion and absorption of nutrients and water. So your GI system produces a lot of water, so water is still being absorbed in the large intestine, but if you drink water, most of that will be absorbed in the small intestine. Okay? Greatest amount of digestion and absorption of nutrients and water. All biomolecules can be broken down in the small intestine. Okay, so it has its divisions. We're mainly going to talk about the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine, right? So that pyloric sphincter is letting the food out of the stomach. Here, I don't know if the pyloric sphincter is labeled here, but it's here. And so it lets a little bit of the food out and it lets it right into the duodenum. Okay? And that's the first part. And that's where we get into more complicated, I don't know, stuff you have to study, I guess, stuff that happens in the small intestine. So when food moves into the duodenum, accessory organs are activated. Now we're going to spend part 2 talking about the liver and the bile and the pancreas and all that other stuff, but we're going to kind of introduce it here. Remember when the presence of food was kind of sending a signal to like the gastrin, the G cells in the stomach? The arrival of food in the duodenum also signals something. So food, the presence of food and low pH will trigger the intestine to start doing its job. So the low pH, because there was a low pH, the stomach acid, is going to stimulate the secretion of this thing called secretin. So secretion of secretin. And what that's going to do, so now food is in the duodenum, low pH because it just came from the stomach, stimulates secretin release, which causes the pancreas to produce this thing called bicarbonate. Bicarbonate is very basic. Do you see what we're doing here? Okay. Very basic, very high pH. So all this is saying is that when stomach acid gets into the small intestine, it's immediately neutralized. And it does that because the pancreas is going to squirt in this thing. It's going to start squirting in bicarbonate. And bicarbonate's going to fix that pH. The pH goes from being very acidic down here up to a more neutral pH. Okay. So produces bicarbonate to raise the pH of the stomach secretions. So nutrients, fats, and proteins. So if you eat something that's fatty, especially, it's going to stimulate this thing called cholecystokinin, or CCK. Cholecystokinin is then, because you're going to have to digest these fats, and it's going to make more sense when we talk about bile, but cholecystokinin is going to stimulate the release of enzymes from the pancreas, because the pancreas makes these enzymes, most of these enzymes, and it's going to cause release of bile by the liver. This is going to be important. Bile is going to be important, especially for fats. So when you eat something with a lot of fats, then you're going to start dumping bile onto those fats. And it's this this hormone, this cholecystokinin, that's going to trigger the pancreas and the liver to start doing their jobs. Because remember, they're accessory organs. They're sitting up there just waiting for a signal. This is their signal, cholecystokinin. It's one of them. Okay, so CCK stimulates the release of enzymes from the pancreas and release of bile by the liver and gallbladder. And you know what else it does? It's saying, you know what, if we have fats and proteins in our intestine, we must have just eaten. So it will also send a signal back to your brain saying, hey, we're full. This is why people say that eating more slowly is a good way to lose weight, because it gives a chance for this food to kind of start to move through, push through a little bit and say, brain, we're full. We've got food. We don't need any more. Okay? So a lot of little rules by that. All right, so what are the pancreatic secretions? The pancreas, we've sort of talked about the pancreas because it makes insulin and glucagon, but that's only a very small part of what it does. The main thing, and this is it's what we call exocrine function, is that it makes enzymes. So we call it pancreatic juice. I like that name because it's ridiculous. Pancreatic juice, it's like apple juice, orange juice, pancreatic juice, but that's what it's called. And it has bicarbonate into them and in it, and it has enzymes that are capable of breaking down all 4 biomolecules. And we don't need to necessarily, I have them listed here, but we don't need to get too obsessed with the names. The proteins are broken down. The enzymes that the pancreas makes are trypsin, chymotrypsin, procarboxypeptidase. You don't have to really remember all of those. Maybe just recognize them, that they are breaking down proteins. But the carbohydrates, this is important, and it should be easy to learn, makes pancreatic amylase. So pancreatic amylase is made by the pancreas, and it breaks down carbohydrates. Okay? Lipids, pancreatic lipases, break down lipids. That makes sense. And then these other things that, I don't know, I guess they just got lazy with the naming, so they just called the enzymes that break down DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid, they just call them deoxyribonucleases and ribonucleases. They break down DNA and RNA. Okay? So, yeah, and that's where all of your digestion takes place. The pancreas has 99% exocrine, 1% endocrine function. That's always a happy little test question because, I don't know, hopefully we assume you know what that means. But exocrine just means that it's secreting stuff and putting it into a different environment outside. Endocrine means that it's going into the blood. So I guess that's the better way to remember it. If you remember, endocrine function is going into the blood, and that's really, among other things, but that's insulin, glucagon. Those are the things that kind of control your blood glucose levels. Most of us have heard of insulin. That's that 1% endocrine function. Exocrine, it's, in this case, excreting it into your, well, it's going into your small intestine, into your duodenum. Okay, so I'm worn out, so I'm going to stop. And also, this is the last slide, so that's another reason I'm going to stop. And I'll post part 2 for you later.